G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. Today we are looking at something a little different to my usual team selection and race week preview videos. I have for you my chip strategy guide for 2024 and we will be going through optimal times to deploy those chips and how this can implicate your fantasy strategy throughout the calendar. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Before we get into dissecting each of the different chips, and later in the video reviewing some of the optimal weekends to deploy those chips, wanted to take a look at chip strategy generally speaking. Now for each team and when you deploy those chips, it is going to differ and is dependent on how you've approached building your team in the lead up to the weekend you choose to use one of those chips. I think another thing to keep in mind as well is be flexible and open to different approaches depending on what your rank is, what your team structure is, and how many points those chips can garner in any single race weekend. But I think realistically, the takeaway I've had, certainly since last season when F1 introduced a number of these chips into the game, was as long as you're engaged and active throughout the season, managing your team and your chips week to week is going to ensure that you don't fall behind in the ranks. And you're essentially on top of when you use those chips and when you're able to score points. Even if you do have instances or weekends where it does not go to plan, which I myself have been prone to. One such example was Limitless at Circuit of the Americas when Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton, both in my team, were disqualified. Staying engaged and approaching each weekend with flexibility and I guess an open mind but a plan as to when you want to use those chips and how you want to structure your team is going to put you in good stead throughout the season. Also, with so many managers that lose interest, certainly by the halfway point in the season, there's lots of opportunity to gain rank and make the most of those spare chips you've got available when a lot of people have given up and have got a lot of unused chips just sitting there and obviously working in the favor of those who do stay engaged and manage when they're used to deploy them. There's also, most interestingly about F1 Fantasy, so many different strategies you can deploy. And I've got two different approaches, fantasy strategists could take towards the end of the video. So be sure to stay around for that. But I think realistically, go with your gut and go with what seems right for you and your team. Just because I might want to approach using my chips one way does not necessarily mean that it is the only way or the right way to deploy them. I've already seen several strategists on Twitter and on YouTube put forward suggestions as to when they want to activate certain chips at certain weekends. And, theoretically, they all sound great. I don't necessarily think there's only one way to use them, and you'll certainly find if you're active on Twitter in the comments, on my YouTube channel and other forums, that lots of different strategists have different approaches. So I definitely think there's going to be a lot of divergence as we get into the weeds of the sprint races, which is one such time a lot of people will deploy certain chips. And I definitely think ranks will certainly shake out certainly by the halfway point in the season once a few chips have been used. So we're going to go through each of the different chips quickly and then tackle a few different approaches I've got in mind for later in the season. The first chip I want to cover off is, in my opinion, one of the more powerful ones in the game, the 3x DRS Boost, which allows the user to assign the normal 2x DRS Boost scoring chip to any driver in their team, along with a separate chip, the 3x point multiplier, to a separate driver in your team. It is worth noting you cannot double stack this, so you can't have Max Verstappen with the 5 times, but you will find a lot of people use the 3x on Max Verstappen and have the 2x on someone like Sergio Perez or Charles Leclerc, because they are two drivers that have demonstrated so far this season that they can score a lot of points on their day. The best times to use them is on a sprint weekend, because that's when the most points are on the table to be scored. We've got an extra session of scoring points in the sprint race itself. We don't get points for the sprint shootout, but we still also get points that weekend for normal qualifying and the Grand Prix. And when used effectively at the right time, can bring in an absolute haul of points. Last season, I used it at Austria with Max and Checo as the 3 and the 2 times respectively. And it was my highest scoring weekend throughout the entire season with more than 500 points. So if that's anything to go by, definitely consider using it on a sprint race weekend, because that's where the most upside to score points is. And also see if you can time it with a track that has a very good history for the drivers you want to use it on. There's a high chance of no wet weather, and it's early enough in the season where mechanical gremlins, reliability issues have not crept in yet. Certainly when there's a clear-cut top 1 or 2 best teams and drivers to deploy those chips on. So I'll get into some optimal times to use that later in the video, but sprint weekends for me for the extra DRS boost 3x is my pick for when you want to use that chip then. The Limitless is another chip that is extremely powerful when used correctly. At its most basic form, it is unlimited transfers and unlimited budget for 1 week only. Once you activate that chip, it will reset your team to the following week from the previous week. And the best time to use it is much like the 3x, the sprint weekends. There are going to be some instances, as we saw in Monza last year, when some strategists deployed it successfully, given Ferrari and Mercedes had very good weekends then. But the best time and who to use it on is typically sprint weekends on drivers in the best teams and constructors from the best teams. At the moment, Red Bull and Ferrari are the best 2 teams. So they are the assets to target when using the Limitless around this time of the year. Now, there is some nuances around when and how this can affect your team value and transfers. So I will bring up on my screen a tweet I put out recently around how this can affect your team value and transfers week to week. I'll read this tweet out, which I put out the week after you use Limitless. Commonly on sprint weekends, I find anyway, you will have the same team as the previous week. So let's say, for instance, we're going into China, which is the next Grand Prix at the time of recording. The team you had in Japan will be the team you have in Miami prior to any transfers you make for Miami, assuming you activate Limitless in China. One thing also around transfers is if you make a transfer ahead of China, you want to try and plan for a week ahead, and then you activate the Limitless, that transfer you make will auto reverse. So it won't go through if you've activated Limitless, and it won't be in your team, or that new driver you've wanted to transfer before activating Limitless won't be in your team once the Limitless weekend concludes. And you cannot roll a transfer after activating Limitless. So right now I have 3 transfers available. And let's say I wanted to use Limitless at China. If I wanted to not use any of these transfers, then use Limitless in China, I will not have 3 transfers available in Miami. I will only have 2. And after using Limitless, you will always only have 2 free transfers. And your non-Limitless teams will be the ones that accrue the increases in team value. You will not get increases in price for those drivers and constructors you bring in on Limitless for that 1 weekend. You get the team you had before, say, China, for instance. So my team in Japan is going to be the team that gets the price increases at the conclusion of the China weekend if I have activated Limitless in China. Hopefully that makes sense. I've tried to be as clear cut as possible, but there is obviously something to think about here with respect to activating Limitless. Certainly if you've rolled transfers or approaching building team value in a way that doesn't necessarily favor it if you've decided to use Limitless around one of those budget building weeks. So that's Limitless in a nutshell. Another powerful chip. Autopilot's the next one I wanted to look at, and that essentially reassigns the 2 times point multiplier to your highest scoring driver that weekend for 1 week only. So let's say, for instance, you've got Sergio Perez as your standard 2x DRS boost, but you've also got Oscar Piastri in your team for that weekend. And one such time you might want to use it is if a driver is taking an engine penalty, because that opens the door for extra overtakes and positions gained starting further back. So let's say Oscar Piastri takes an engine penalty. He starts 20th, Perez starts 5th. Oscar, by the end of the race, has, let's say, accumulated 10 overtakes, 10 positions gained, maybe has scored the driver of the day for that drive through the field, and is more often than not going to score points more than, say, someone that kind of starts around P5 like Perez would in this example. As a result, because you're not sure how well Piastri will do before he's started the race on the Sunday, you assign the 2x autopilot chip because you're not sure who's going to score more out of Perez and Piastri. By the end of the weekend, if Piastri has scored more than Perez, which would usually be your 2x, Piastri will get the 2x point multiplier. Perez will just have whatever points he scores for that weekend without the point multiplier. So I find the best times to use autopilot is one such time where a driver, as I said, might take an engine penalty, starts a bit further back. When there's wet weather weekends, there's some degree of risk. Drivers may not finish the race. It's more of an insurance policy to hedge against your 2x boost driver, or if we're at circuits where there's a high DNF risk. And I guess that kind of goes hand in hand with wet weather because there's more risk of drivers crashing. Street circuits can typically be quite challenging. There's some degree of risk there. We saw Stroll struggle in Saudi Arabia. We know Logan Sargent is always a risk. So if you've got drivers, not necessarily Stroll and Sargent, for instance, but drivers that you would otherwise, like Perez, have the 2x on and you're worried he may not be able to deliver a good performance, then maybe that's a time to think about using the autopilot chip. No Negative is one such chip that's had a change to its kind of scoring matrix in 2024. Last season, any drivers that scored less than 0 across the entire weekend will have their scores reset to 0. This season, however, scoring categories that are negative are reset to 0 only. So one such example is a DNF. If your driver has a good qualifying and then makes a few overtakes and positions gain on the Sunday, but after that has a DNF, only the DNF will be reset back to 0. Any points they've accrued from qualifying, let's say they've got 10 points from qualifying, they've got 5 overtakes and 5 positions gain on the Sunday, all of those points stay positive and are not affected by the DNF penalty. So those scores will be as is, and the DNF minus 20 alone will only go back to 0. So it is, I think, a good change for the chip. But again, you have to think about when those higher risk negative points weekends are going to arise. Again, wet weather can be a risk. The DNF circuits with higher DNF risk is also another example. But I think for me, the fact that the scoring change to these to this chip in particular means that sprint weekends is also one other example where drivers are at risk of scoring less than 0. There are more sessions to DNF, so other than just the race on the Sunday, we now have the sprint race and the Grand Prix. So one extra session where a driver is at risk of losing positions, of a DNF risk, etc. So maybe, I'm just thinking about this out loud here, maybe China, we've not raced there. Maybe later in the season where there's tracks that have kind of a wet weather history, like Brazil, which is also a sprint race. Maybe a street circuit like Las Vegas, Singapore, for instance. Just some examples of when you could deploy the no negative chip. Or if you think there's just, you have a gut feel about a certain track or how drivers have performed in practice that makes you think there's some merit in using no negative for that weekend. For the wildcard, pretty stock standard in terms of most fantasy sports. Unlimited transfers up to the team value you have accrued at the time you activate the chip. So for instance, if you've accrued 105 million in team value through the first 4 races of the season, you're able to wildcard and use the wildcard, make as many transfers once you activate the chip up to the team value you have accrued. It affects drivers and constructors, so all 7 slots are open to change at no cost to your team. And the best time I find to use that is when there's a clear shift in the medal lineup. So right now we're seeing a lot of people that run Sergio Perez or Charles Leclerc or Carlos Sainz with Red Bull and Ferrari, moving into a transitional period for the game where a lot of people are now moving towards Max Verstappen and Red Bull and Ferrari as the 2 constructors. But to get to Max Verstappen, instead of Sergio Perez, you're likely going to have to downgrade other drivers in price like Lance Stroll, Yuki Tsunoda, Kevin Magnussen, etc. for those Saubers and those Williams drivers as just some examples. So when you're getting to that point and you're taking minus 10 or minus 20 or minus 30 transfer hits to make that a reality for your team, that's when the wildcard can come into play. I think you can make a case for only taking a -10 that you could go without the wildcard, and I myself am weighing that up for China. But you could also hold off and wait till later in the season where we might see an emergence of another team enter the meta or the template lineup. We saw that with McLaren in 2023, where as Aston Martin were regressing, Lando Norris, Oscar Piastri, and the McLaren constructor came into our teams at very short notice, and a lot of people were taking penalty hits to get these drivers and constructors into their team in favor of Aston Martin. So we might see something like that. It isn't frequent or that common. We see such a drastic change in performance from any single team midway through the season, but if anything quite like that happened, then maybe it is time to activate the wildcard. And the last chip we were going to look at is the Final Fix chip. Now, this is quite an interesting chip to use. It is very hard to plan for it because you can only make a single change to your driver lineup between qualifying and the race. You cannot change constructors using this chip. It is only for drivers, and you can use it on a sprint weekend or on a normal Grand Prix weekend for any drivers within budget. So let's say you have Charles Leclerc in your team. If you wanted to get Sergio Perez in place of Charles Leclerc, let's say he had an issue like Carlos Sainz did in Qatar in 2023, where he has an oil leak, he's not able to participate in the race, then you might want to move Charles Leclerc out in favor of someone else. If you want to move to Sergio Perez, you need to have the budget to get to Perez. You cannot just transfer any driver in. You can't go from Leclerc to Verstappen. If you want to do that, you need to have the budget to make that single trade. So if you want to go from Leclerc to Perez, you need to have, 1 to 2 million of free cash available to make that swap. If you don't have it, it's anyone below Charles' price that you can bring in. So a Carlos Sainz, a George Russell, a Lewis Hamilton type driver. It is, as I said, very hard to predict. And as I mentioned, the pre-race withdrawal from Sainz was one such example. If another driver is maybe in your team taking a back of the grid penalty, as I made that example before, there's opportunities to make additional passes, overtakes, etc. So consider maybe when something like that happens, bringing in a driver that's likely to score more points. One thing I will say around sprint weekends and how it works then is that you can play the chip between qualifying and the sprint, or between the sprint and the Grand Prix. But once you commit to the chip, a team lock deadline to use the chip will appear. And this is until the next session commences. So the chip must be played before the next session starts. So if you activate it at qualifying, you get Charles Leclerc out, you bring Carlos Sainz in. You need to, or if you want to do that, you have to make that decision between qualifying and the sprint. If you wait until after the sprint, the chip will lapse. But if you bring in Carlos Sainz for Charles Leclerc between qualifying and the sprint, you have Carlos Sainz for the sprint race and the Grand Prix. If you bring in Carlos Sainz between the sprint race and the Grand Prix, you get Charles Leclerc's points for qualifying in the sprint, and you get Carlos Sainz's points for the Grand Prix. So hopefully that makes sense. It is a little bit of a confusing chip, but just keep that in mind that once you activate the chip, you cannot go back, and it has to essentially be used, and a decision or a trade has to be made. Otherwise it will lapse. But one other thing to note is that you will not incur a penalty if you've already used all of your free transfers that week. So let's say you've used all 3 free transfers, you have a 4th to make at no extra cost. And if, for instance, Charles Leclerc is the 2x driver in your team, his points, 2 times point multiplier, will be assigned to Carlos Sainz for whatever sessions you bring Sainz in for at obviously Charles Leclerc's expense if he was to miss out on the Grand Prix. Again, a little bit confusing, but I tried to make it as clear as possible because it is quite a nuanced chip. So I wanted to quickly go through a couple of opportunities when to deploy chips. There's no right or wrong way to do this. I've just kind of done a bit of a thought dump down here on this page. And then on the next one, maybe a couple of varying strategies you might want to think about. But again, as I said, there's no one single way to skin a cat. And I just wanted to get you some ideas of my own. You can certainly use them. You can certainly deviate from them, whatever works. I just think now that we're getting into this part of the season where we've got, 3 sprints in the first half of the season, and then the back half of the season with Coda, Interlagos and Qatar, very heavy chip usage times for a lot of these chips we've covered off. Heading into China, it is a sprint race. It is a circuit we haven't raced at since 2019. I'm not so sure it's a circuit for me that I want to use Limitless. But I do want to use Limitless in the first half of the season where our budgets are still quite low and we have the flexibility to get in multiple premium drivers and constructors while a lot of people don't have the budgets to also cover those bases as well. Right now, a lot of us can afford Red Bull and Ferrari constructor and one of Sergio Perez, Charles Leclerc, Max Verstappen, Carlos Sainz. But obviously with the Limitless chip, you can have triple Red Bull, triple Ferrari, and let's say Lando Norris. I think Miami, I really like that circuit. I think Ferrari and Red Bull will do quite well on those straights there. And I definitely think it's early enough in the season where there's a clear 1-2 pecking order for the best teams on the grid. I could then potentially wildcard out my team for Imola, get in Max Verstappen, Red Bull and Ferrari, assuming I have enough value accrued for those at this point in time. And then later in the season, use the Autopilot, where at a sprint race like Baku, a street circuit like Baku, somewhat of a higher degree of DNFs. We may see some engine failures in the second half of the season. So that could be one such time to use the Autopilot chip, kind of hedging that risk. Then we've got the 3X at Coda. I'm a bit scarred from using Limitless there last season, but I think by that time we should have enough value for 2 premium drivers and 2 premium constructors without having to compromise on our teams if I was to use that chip right now. If I did use it in, let's say, China, and I wanted to use the 3X, I'd run Max and I'd run Perez, but I'd probably only have enough budget for Ferrari and a Haas. Like I wouldn't be able to do 2 premiums and drivers and constructors as of right now, but I think by that point in the season, should be able to make that a reality. And then the no negative in Brazil, little bit of wet weather risk there. I think late in the season enough where we've got engine penalties risk of DNFs around mechanical failures and such. And is a sprint race weekend at Interlagos. So there is a bit more risk around extra DNFs in an extra session. So that's kind of where my head is at for one such approach. Again, haven't really thought this out entirely, but I do want to have a general plan of when I could potentially deploy some of these chips. If you don't like this strategy, I've got another one here. Again, just kind of an initial thought on where this could work out. No negative in China, and I'm seeing a lot of people use Limitless at China. I think that's certainly fine. I don't think I've got the guts to be able to do that because it is a circuit that we haven't raced at in a while. And Limitless, you want to be confident you're using a really powerful chip at a circuit you know will score the most points. I think there will be a lot of points on the table in China, but I'm just worried there could be the odd DNF or two that could cripple my lineup. And I've got obviously trauma from Circuit of the Americas last year that I'm not so sure I want to take another risk on at China. So I've got the no negative there, an extra session of DNF risk that could potentially unfold. Then wildcard out a lot of the deadwood in Miami to set my team up for the sprint race, maybe get Max in, maybe get and have the Red Bull Ferrari combination, just set my team up nicely as we head into the end of the first half of the season, and then use Limitless in Austria, where Red Bull has a very good record there. Max and Checo had a sensational 1-2 result there last year at the Red Bull Ring. So I think I really do want to get rid of the Limitless chip in the first half of the season while budgets are still low. Belgian Grand Prix, again, wet weather. I'm not so sure. It is a circuit that can reward, but can also, when it's wet, really cause some risk. So we'll see. Again, that's kind of just one circuit that stood out to me for the Autopilot. And also at that point, we may also have 2 premium drivers in our team by then. So let's see how that unfolds. Again, pretty kind of finger in the air guesstimate of when I could use Autopilot. And then the 3X chip at Qatar, very late in the season. And I think by that point, it will also be quite clear kind of which 2 teams or which teams are strong, which 2 drivers are likely to win. So at a track where there's almost going to be 0 wet weather at Qatar, less risk of those heat concerns because it's a little bit later in the calendar, last sprint race of the season. If it's close, or if it's not close, I mean to say, in the Drivers and Constructors Championship, people may have checked out. I'm not quite sure. Again, I think it's a sprint race that I'm going to want to use the 3x DRS boost. And if it's not the United States, it's probably going to be Qatar before I get to Brazil. Unless, of course, Brazil is going to be a dry weekend. And there's also a little bit of certainty around who's going to score the most then. But I think that's kind of where my head's at. A couple of different strategies. Hopefully it can give you some inspiration when you want to use it, and how that can affect your decisions for your lineups and building value. But yeah, I think I'll leave that there for now, guys. I'll be back with my team selection and race week preview thoughts closer to race week for China. But as always, I greatly appreciate you dropping by. If you've got any comments, feedback, or questions, thoughts of your own on how you want to approach using your chips, drop them down in the comments below, because I'd love to answer them. Love to get your 2 cents on whether or not you agree or disagree with my opinions. I'm not saying I'm 100% right. I'm not even saying I'm that right. But to be honest, just wanted to map this out for the season ahead, because it is very interesting. And as we're getting into the sprint races, I think we're going to see a lot of chips flying as people try and gain rank. But as always, appreciate you guys dropping by. I'll be back later, closer to the Chinese Grand Prix race week. I'll see you all very soon.